Imagine standing on the pristine, marble driveway of a sprawling seven-figure estate in the hills, holding the keys to a twin-turbocharged supercar you know you will never own. For 5 years, Julian wore the pristine white gloves, kept his posture perfectly straight, and held the door open for a man who treated him like absolute background noise. To the world, Arthur Vance was the billionaire titan of industry, and Julian was just the silent shadow behind the wheel of his luxury phantom sedan. But out here, where the tint is dark and the secrets are heavy, the world has it completely backward. You see, the most dangerous lie isn't the one you tell society, it's the one society begs to believe because of the clothes you wear. Arthur thought he owned the road, the car, and the man driving it. He had no idea that the quiet man in the front seat didn't just understand the game, he built the board, financed the pieces, and was simply waiting for the perfect moment to pull the emergency brake and watch Arthur's entire fabricated empire shatter against the concrete reality of who actually held the title. The morning sun always hit the gold leaf gates of the Vance estate with a blinding brilliance, casting long, sharp shadows across the impeccably manicured lawn. Julian adjusted his rearview mirror, ensuring his cap was perfectly level, his eyes completely unreadable behind a pair of dark aviators. To anyone passing by, he was the definition of invisible luxury. He was a human extension of the vehicle's engineering, smooth, quiet, efficient, and entirely compliant. For exactly half a decade, Julian's entire existence was measured in smooth braking, perfectly timed arrivals, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the rear passenger door closing. Behind that door sat Arthur Vance. Arthur was a man whose ego was as loud as his tailored suits. He was a venture capitalist who built his reputation on ruthless acquisitions, fiery public speeches, and an absolute disdain for anyone he deemed beneath his tax bracket. To Arthur, Julian wasn't a person with a history, a family, or an intellect. Julian was simply a utility, a voice-activated mechanism that navigated the morning traffic while Arthur yelled at board members over encrypted satellite calls. Arthur would routinely talk about millions of dollars, hostile takeovers, and devastating financial maneuvers as if the man driving him was nothing more than a deaf piece of machinery. But contrast is a funny thing. The louder a man speaks, the less he actually hears. And while Arthur spent his morning screaming into his headset, boasting about his flawless intuition, Julian listened. He listened to the names of shell companies, the stress in Arthur's voice when certain quarterly projections failed to meet expectations, and the subtle, desperate shifts in strategy that signaled a man drowning in his own ambition. Arthur believed his driver was trapped in the front seat by economic necessity. The truth, however, was far more terrifying. Julian wasn't trapped in the car, he was occupying it. The build-up to this specific morning had taken years of calculated patience. To understand how a man in a chauffeur's uniform could actually hold the strings to a billionaire's destiny, you have to look at the foundation of the Vance empire itself. 5 years ago, Arthur's primary investment firm, Apex Capital, was on the verge of total collapse after a disastrous tech spec failure. Out of nowhere, an anonymous private equity fund known only as Horizon Trust injected $40 million of liquidity, saving Apex from bankruptcy in exchange for non-voting preferred shares and a highly specific, dormant clause in a corporate charter. Arthur, desperate to save face and maintain his billionaire lifestyle, signed the paperwork without looking twice at the hidden architecture of the deal. He assumed Horizon Trust was just a faceless conglomerate of wealthy foreign investors looking for passive yield. He never imagined the capital belonged to the quiet, disciplined man he hired 3 weeks later to drive him to the office. Julian's background wasn't one of generational wealth, but of hyper-disciplined financial engineering. He had operated at the highest levels of institutional finance under a different name before choosing to vanish into the open light. He realized early on that the greatest leverage you can have over a powerful man is to let him believe he is completely superior to you. By wearing the uniform, Julian gained access to an unfiltered, daily audit of Arthur's psychological flaws, his vulnerabilities, and his deepest corporate secrets. Every phone call Arthur made was a data point. Every sigh of relief or flash of anger was a market signal. As the phantom sedan glided effortlessly through the financial district, the tension inside the cabin was palpable. Arthur was sweating, his collar slightly damp, furiously typing on his encrypted tablet. He was on the verge of closing the largest merger of his career, a deal that would finally cement his status as an untouchable kingmaker. He just needed to clear one final hurdle, a routine compliance sign-off from his primary shareholder, Horizon Trust. Arthur dialed his attorney, his voice trembling with a mixture of arrogance and anxiety. "Get me the trustee on the line now. If they don't sign the authorization by 4 p.m., the merger falls through, and we lose the bridge loan." Julian watched Arthur's panicked reflection in the rearview mirror. The contrast was magnificent, the billionaire trembling in the back, powerless, while the driver calmly accelerated through a yellow light, completely at peace. Arthur had no idea that the very trustee he was desperately trying to reach was currently keeping his hands firmly on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock. Arthur slammed his encrypted tablet onto the leather seat beside him, the impact echoing loudly in the enclosed space of the luxury vehicle. "Drive faster, Julian. I don't pay you to admire the scenery. If I miss this meeting, your job is the absolute least of the casualties today." Julian didn't flinch. He didn't tighten his grip on the steering wheel, nor did his heart rate elevate by a single beat. Instead, he simply adjusted the climate control by 2 degrees, ensuring the air in the back was perfectly chilled to counteract the billionaire's rising blood pressure. "Right away, Mr. Vance," Julian replied, his voice a masterclass in calm, subservient neutrality. To anyone else, it looked like a terrified employee complying with a tyrannical boss. But to Julian, it was the ultimate confirmation of control. The trap was already locked, Arthur was just frantically running around inside it, completely blind to the steel bars. The illusion of power is a fragile glass structure, and Arthur Vance was throwing rocks from the inside. As the car navigated the tight, crowded corridors of the city's banking sector, Arthur's phone rang again. This time, it was his chief financial officer, whose voice leaked through the high-end speaker system with a high-pitched note of absolute panic. "Arthur, we have a catastrophic problem. Horizon Trust just moved their entire liquid position out of our operational accounts. The bridge loan isn't just delayed, it's being recalled. They are citing a material breach of the corporate charter from our acquisitions last quarter. If we don't restore that capital within the next 2 hours, the board is legally obligated to strip you of your voting rights." Arthur's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of ash gray that contrasted sharply with his bright red silk tie. "What do you mean they recalled it? They can't do that. Who authorized the breach finding? Find out who the lead trustee is. I will buy them out, I will ruin them, I will do whatever it takes." He was screaming now, his voice cracking against the soundproof acoustic glass of the sedan. In the front seat, Julian gently applied the brakes, bringing the massive vehicle to a perfectly smooth stop at a red light directly opposite the towering glass monolith of Apex Capital's headquarters. Julian checked his watch. It was exactly 2:15 p.m. The countdown was ticking perfectly in line with his multi-year algorithm. This is the psychological reality of high-stakes deception. The louder a man screams, the less he is capable of observing the obvious. Arthur was looking for an enemy across the globe, searching for a rival hedge fund in New York or a hostile sovereign wealth fund in Europe. He was looking everywhere except 12 inches in front of his own face. He was looking at the back of a black uniform cap, entirely unaware that the man wearing it was currently monitoring the live liquidation of Apex Capital on a hidden heads-up display built directly into the driver's side dashboard panel. "Julian!" Arthur barked, leaning forward so close that Julian could smell the expensive, stale espresso on his breath. "Change of plans. Don't pull into the main garage. Circle the block. I need time to think. I need this car completely quiet. If anyone calls, I'm unavailable. Do you understand me?" "Perfectly, Mr. Vance," Julian murmured, signaling left and smoothly transitioning into the outer lane of the financial plaza. The contrast between the two men at this exact moment was stark enough to split the air. In the back seat sat a man who believed his net worth made him a god, yet he was currently reduced to a sweating, trembling mess, paralyzed by the sudden movement of numbers on a screen. In the front seat sat a man who owned nothing but the uniform on his back in the eyes of the law, yet he possessed the absolute, unwavering calm of a seasoned grandmaster delivering a final, unblockable checkmate. Julian knew that true ownership isn't about having your name written on a building, it's about having the absolute authority to decide who gets to walk through the front door. Arthur began pacing with his phone, his thoughts erratic, his language becoming increasingly abusive as he dialed proxy after proxy, trying to find a backdoor into Horizon Trust. He was desperate to find a single human being who could grant him an audience with the mysterious owner. There has to be a physical proxy. Arthur shouted into the phone at his legal counsel. A fund that size doesn't operate by ghost protocols. Someone has to sign the physical asset transfers. Find out who holds the power of attorney for Horizon. Julian took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool leather of the steering wheel beneath his fingertips. The irony was almost poetic. For 5 years, Arthur had signed off on monthly vehicle maintenance reports, fuel expenses, and garage parking fees, all issued by a secondary subsidiary called Horizon Logistics. Arthur had signed his own name next to Julian's name hundreds of times, completely blind to the corporate architecture connecting the driver's payroll directly to the holding company that owned 40% of his life. Arthur had looked at the truth every single month, but because he viewed Julian as a lower form of life, his brain literally edited the significance out of the picture. He saw a servant, so he couldn't see a master. As the car completed its first circle around the massive financial block, the traffic began to thicken, pinning the luxury vehicle between a city bus and a delivery truck. Arthur looked out the window like a caged animal. His empire evaporating with every tick of the dashboard clock. He had no idea the second hand was moving purely by Julian's design. The atmosphere inside the vehicle shifted from a state of controlled panic to absolute, suffocating terror as Arthur's phone pinged with a high-priority, encrypted email notification. The notification sound was a sharp, digital chime that seemed to slice through the heavy silence of the cabin. Arthur snatched the device, his eyes darting across the glowing screen as he read the emergency update from the Apex Capital Executive Board. His breathing stopped entirely. The board had just convened an emergency proxy vote in his absence, triggered by the sudden capital flight. They hadn't just stripped him of his voting rights, they had successfully executed a forced buyout option contained within the hidden charter clauses from 5 years ago. Arthur Vance was no longer the CEO of Apex Capital. He was no longer the majority shareholder. He was, effective immediately, a terminated employee of the very empire that bore his family name. No, this is legally impossible. Arthur choked out, his voice dropping to a horrified, breathless whisper. His arrogance had completely shattered, replaced by the raw, primal panic of a man who realized the ground beneath his feet had completely turned to smoke. They sold the entire debt portfolio to an undisclosed parent entity. The board surrendered to a single buyer. Who bought me out? Who could possibly have that much liquid capital cleared in 20 minutes? He slammed his fists against the back of Julian's seat, his manicured nails digging into the premium leather. Julian! Stop the car. Pull over right now. I don't care about the traffic, pull over on the sidewalk. Julian did not pull over. Instead, he smoothly engaged the central locking system. The heavy, mechanical thud of the security locks engaging resonated through the doors like the closing of a bank vault. Arthur froze, his eyes widening as he tried to pull the manual door handle, only to find it completely unresponsive. Julian, did you hear me? I said stop the vehicle. What is wrong with this car? Open the doors. Arthur demanded, his voice rising in pitch as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He leaned forward, reaching out to grab Julian's shoulder, but before his hand could make contact, Julian spoke. It wasn't the quiet, deferential voice of a submissive chauffeur that Arthur had heard for the past 5 years. It was a cold, commanding, deeply resonant voice that carried the absolute weight of an apex predator. Sit back down, Arthur, Julian said calmly, his eyes remaining fixed on the road ahead as he navigated through the heavy traffic. Arthur recoiled as if he had been struck. The sheer psychological contrast of his invisible driver suddenly issuing an order paralyzed him. What did you just say to me? You are a driver. You are my employee. I will have you blacklisted from every agency in this country. Unlock these doors before I call the police. You can call whoever you like, Julian replied, his tone entirely detached, completely unbothered by the threat. But your phone won't have a cellular signal in approximately 3 seconds. Right on cue, the signal indicator on Arthur's tablet and phone dropped to 0 as Julian activated the military-grade signal jammer installed beneath the front passenger seat. The screens turned into useless bricks of glass and aluminum. Arthur stared at his dead phone, then up at the rearview mirror, finally looking at Julian's eyes instead of just looking past him. For the first time in 5 years, Arthur truly saw the man behind the wheel. The realization didn't hit him all at once, it rolled over him like a slow, devastating wave of horror. "You," Arthur whispered, his mind frantically assembling the pieces of the puzzle he had ignored for half a decade. The anonymous capital injection 5 years ago. The highly specific legal clauses. The fact that the mysterious Horizon Trust always seemed to know Apex Capital's exact internal vulnerabilities before anyone else did. The fact that his driver was always present during his most confidential, sensitive business calls, sitting silently in the front seat like a piece of recording equipment. It was you. You're the trustee. You're the proxy for Horizon. I am not the proxy, Arthur, Julian corrected him smoothly, easing the sedan into the private, underground executive parking garage of the Apex Capital skyscraper, a garage that Arthur no longer had the legal right to enter. The massive steel security garage door closed slowly behind them, cutting off the daylight and plunging the vehicle into the harsh, artificial glow of fluorescent lights. Julian brought the vehicle to a perfectly calculated stop in the designated space marked CEO parking only. He turned off the engine, pulling the keyless fob from the dash. The silence in the car became absolute, heavy enough to crush a lesser man. Julian slowly reached up, removed his uniform cap, and placed it neatly on the passenger seat. He turned around in his seat, looking directly into Arthur's terrified, unblinking eyes. I am not the proxy, Julian repeated, a faint, razor-sharp smile cutting across his face. I am the sole founder, owner, and majority capital allocator of Horizon Trust. I don't manage the funds for foreign investors, Arthur. The $40 million that saved your dying company 5 years ago belonged entirely to me. Which means, as of 20 minutes ago, I don't just own this car. I own the building we are currently parked under, I own the patents to the products you sold. You, Arthur whispered, his mind frantically assembling the pieces of the puzzle he had ignored for half a decade. The anonymous capital injection 5 years ago. The highly specific legal clauses. The fact that the mysterious Horizon Trust always seemed to know Apex Capital's exact internal vulnerabilities before anyone else did. The fact that his driver was always present during his most confidential, sensitive business calls, sitting silently in the front seat like a piece of recording equipment. It was you. You're the trustee. You're the proxy for Horizon. I am not the proxy, Arthur, Julian corrected him smoothly, easing the sedan into the private, underground executive parking garage of the Apex Capital skyscraper, a garage that Arthur no longer had the legal right to enter. The massive steel security garage door closed slowly behind them, cutting off the daylight and plunging the vehicle into the harsh, artificial glow of fluorescent lights. Julian brought the vehicle to a perfectly calculated stop in the designated space marked CEO parking only. He turned off the engine, pulling the keyless fob from the dash. The silence in the car became absolute, heavy enough to crush a lesser man. Julian slowly reached up, removed his uniform cap, and placed it neatly on the passenger seat. He turned around in his seat, looking directly into Arthur's terrified, unblinking eyes. I am not the proxy, Julian repeated, a faint, razor-sharp smile cutting across his face. I am the sole founder, owner, and majority capital allocator of Horizon Trust. I don't manage the funds for foreign investors, Arthur. The $40 million that saved your dying company 5 years ago belonged entirely to me. Which means, as of 20 minutes ago, I don't just own this car. I own the building we are currently parked under, I own the patents to the products you sold. And I own the debt that you will spend the rest of your natural life trying to repay. Arthur's mouth moved, but no sound came out. His entire reality had been inverted. The man who had cleaned his muddy shoes, the man he had insulated with insults, the man he treated like absolute dirt, was the absolute architect of his ruin. The driver was the real owner. Arthur slumped back into the premium leather seat, the breath completely knocked out of his lungs as if he had suffered a physical blow. The absolute weight of the revelation pressed down on him with agonizing clarity. Every single day for 5 years, he had treated this man like an invisible servant. He had thrown trash into the front seat, screamed profanities when traffic was slow, and openly boasted about how easy it was to manipulate stupid people. And the entire time, the man recording those flaws, the man evaluating his mental stability, was the ultimate owner of his entire life. The contrast between his past arrogance and his current vulnerability was a terrifying mirror. Arthur looked at the locked doors, the dead phone, and the calm, unbothered expression on Julian's face. He realized with absolute horror that he wasn't just losing his company, he had been completely dismantled from the inside out by a ghost he invited into his own house. Why? Arthur finally managed to choke out, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of rage, humiliation, and deep, existential fear. If you had $40 million 5 years ago, why did you do this? Why did you wear that uniform? Why did you open my doors? Why did you let me insult you, treat you like garbage every single day? You could have just bought the company outright back then. Why play this sick, twisted game? Julian leaned back against the driver's door, completely at ease in the quiet safety of the underground garage. He looked at Arthur with the cold, analytical detachment of a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. Because, Arthur, if I had bought you out 5 years ago, you would have taken your millions, walked away, and built another monument to your own ego, Julian explained, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of anger. You would have remained convinced that you were a financial genius who simply suffered a minor setback. You wouldn't have learned anything. And more importantly, you wouldn't have exposed the entire network of your corrupt infrastructure. I didn't want to just buy a company. I wanted to completely eradicate the systemic rot you represented. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive, tossing it carelessly into the back seat. It landed with a soft click against Arthur's expensive leather briefcase. What is this? Arthur asked, staring at the drive as if it were a live explosive. That is the architectural blueprint of your complete undoing, Julian said calmly. You see, for 5 years, you assumed I was just driving you from point A to point B. You forgot that a car is a rolling confession booth. You used your satellite phone to orchestrate illegal insider trading before the tech acquisition last spring. You verbally authorized the inflation of asset values to secure the bridge loan from the European banks. You even detailed the offshore accounts you used to hide capital from your own board members during the restructuring phase. You said all of it right here, sitting exactly where you are sitting now, believing the man in the front seat was too insignificant to comprehend your brilliance. Arthur's heart skipped a beat, his face turning a deep, suffocating shade of crimson. The car is soundproofed. The front cabin is separated. It was soundproofed against the outside world, Arthur, not against me. Julian replied, pointing a single finger toward the small, elegant analog clock embedded in the center dashboard. That clock contains a high-fidelity acoustic array. Every single syllable you uttered in this cabin for the last 60 months has been recorded, encrypted, and automatically uploaded to a secure server maintained by Horizon Trust. But I didn't send it to the regulatory authorities. Not yet. The final reveal was far more devastating than a simple corporate takeover. Julian hadn't just taken the company, he had orchestrated a scenario where Arthur's own hubris would legally trap him. The clauses you signed 5 years ago stated that if Horizon Trust discovered any material misrepresentation of corporate assets, we had the immediate right to seize your personal assets as collateral to protect our investment, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper. The house in the hills, the penthouse in Miami, the offshore trusts, and yes, even the clothes you are wearing right now, they no longer belong to you. They are now the property of Horizon Trust to cover the massive liabilities you created through your fraudulent activities. You aren't just fired, Arthur. You are completely wiped out. You leave this car with absolutely nothing. Arthur stared at the uniform cap sitting on the passenger seat, the realization breaking over him like a physical crushing weight. The driver hadn't just stolen his throne, the driver had allowed him to sit on it just long enough to ensure the fall would completely destroy him. Arthur sat entirely paralyzed in the heavy, suffocating darkness of the rear cabin. The silence of the underground garage felt like a tomb, burying the remains of the identity he had spent his entire adult life constructing. Tears of absolute humiliation and profound despair finally spilled over his eyelids, cutting hot tracks through the expensive cosmetic powder on his face. He looked at his hands, hands that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts, hands that had dismissed hundreds of employees with the stroke of a pen, and realized they were completely empty. Everything he was, everything he valued judged himself by, had been an illusion sustained by the quiet patience of the man sitting just 12 inches in front of him. The utter contrast of his existence was complete. 20 minutes ago he was a king, now, he was a trespasser in a car he couldn't afford, inside a building he no longer owned. Julian reached over, pressed the central unlocking mechanism, and the heavy doors clicked open with a sound that signaled the definitive end of an era. The ambient air of the concrete garage drifted into the luxurious cabin, smelling faintly of rubber, exhaust, and cold reality. Julian did not look back again. He simply put his uniform cap back on, adjusting the brim with the exact same military precision he had used every single morning for 5 years. "Your time in my car has officially concluded, Arthur," Julian said softly, his voice no longer carrying the edge of a corporate executioner, but rather the quiet solemnity of a judge delivering a final verdict. "You can leave the briefcase. It belongs to the company now. Step out." Arthur's movements were clumsy, aged, and broken. He pushed the heavy door open, his polished leather shoes hitting the cold, oil-stained concrete of the executive parking space. As his feet touched the ground, he felt the true weight of his absolute isolation. The security guards who used to salute him, the executives who used to tremble at his approach, the society that cheered his ruthless ambition, none of them were coming to save him. They had never loved Arthur Vance, they had loved the money. And now that the money belonged to the quiet man behind the wheel, Arthur was entirely invisible. He stood on the concrete, his expensive suit looking suddenly oversized and ridiculous, like a child wearing a costume that didn't belong to him. Julian stepped out of the driver's side, completely ignoring the broken billionaire standing by the rear door. He walked calmly to the rear of the phantom sedan, opened the trunk, and retrieved a small, worn canvas duffel bag, the only personal possession he had kept in a vehicle during his 5-year tenure. He slung the bag over his shoulder, walking past Arthur without a single glance, heading toward the private executive elevator that required a biometric scan he now exclusively controlled. Arthur watched him walk away, his voice cracking as he called out one last time into the empty garage. "You ruined me, you took everything I built. How can you just walk away like this? How can you live with yourself after pretending to be my friend, my servant, for all these years?" Julian stopped right at the elevator doors. He turned his head slightly, looking back over his shoulder at the weeping man standing beside the luxury vehicle. The contrast between them was final, absolute, and permanent. "I never pretended to be your friend, Arthur, and I certainly never ruined you," Julian said, his voice echoing softly against the concrete pillars. "You ruined yourself the moment you decided that a person's dignity is determined by their net worth. I didn't steal your life, I simply allowed your own arrogance to collect the debt you owed to every single person you stepped on to get to the top. I wore the uniform because I needed to see if you had a single shred of humanity left inside you, a single moment where you would treat your driver like a human being. In 5 years, you never did. Not once." The elevator doors chimed and slid open, revealing a pristine, mirrored interior. Julian stepped inside, turning around to face the garage as the steel panels began to slide shut. "You see, Arthur," Julian concluded, his voice a gentle, fading whisper as the doors closed between them, "the uniform never defined who I was. But your inability to see past it completely defined who you are. Enjoy the walk home." The elevator swept upward, leaving Arthur Vance entirely alone in the dark, damp basement of his former empire. He sank to his knees on the cold concrete, clutching his chest as the taillights of the phantom sedan slowly flickered out, leaving him in the absolute, crushing silence of a world that had completely forgotten his name. The driver had gone upstairs to take his rightful throne, and the real owner had finally claimed the house. elevator doors chimed and slid open, revealing a pristine, mirrored interior. Julian stepped inside, turning around to face the garage as the steel panels began to slide shut. "You see, Arthur," Julian concluded, his voice a gentle, fading whisper as the doors closed between them, "the uniform never defined who I was. But your inability to see past it completely defined who you are. Enjoy the walk home." The elevator swept upward, leaving Arthur Vance entirely alone in the dark, damp basement of his former empire. He sank to his knees on the cold concrete, clutching his chest as the taillights of the phantom sedan slowly flickered out, leaving him in the absolute, crushing silence of a world that had completely forgotten his name. The driver had gone upstairs to take his rightful throne, and the real owner had finally claimed the house.